Hey there, hope you're all doing well today. You know, there are many folks out there who will say that the first battle of the Civil War was Fort Sumter. Well, technically that really wasn't a battle. Also, some folks will say that the first Bull Run was the first battle of the Civil War. Well, it was the first major battle, but it wasn't the first battle. There were a few other battles, albeit minor, which occurred within the confines of present-day West Virginia. Those battles would have a significant impact on the events that followed. The first of those battles was the Battle of Philippi. It is that battle that we will look at today. So with Lincoln's election, secession began. The states seceded almost in the exact order of the percentage of their slave population, led by South Carolina and Mississippi. The governor of Virginia at the time was John Letcher. He's pictured here on the right. He was a Unionist. However, Letcher faced intense political pressure. So without enthusiasm, Governor Letcher called for an extra session of the General Assembly to meet on January the 7th of 1861. That General Assembly authorized a secession convention to begin on February the 13th. Any decision made at that convention would have to be ratified by a statewide referendum. After nearly 2 months, a vote was finally taken on the secession ordinance. On April the 4th, the ordinance was defeated overwhelmingly by a 2/3 majority. Virginia would remain with the Union. On April the 12th, however, Confederate forces under Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter. Sumter was shelled for 36 hours. Finally, on April the 14th, Major Robert Anderson lowered the flag and evacuated the fort. The next day, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteer troops to suppress the rebellion. This caused many of the delegates at the secession convention to have a change of heart. On April the 17th, another vote was taken. This time, the vote was 88 to 55 in favor of secession. Again now, this action would have to be ratified by voters on May the 23rd. Both sides, however, began preparations for war. In Ohio, Governor William Dennison lobbied George Brinton McClellan to command Ohio's militia forces. McClellan accepted the command on April the 23rd. Dennison then sent McClellan to Columbus to evaluate the state of Ohio's arsenal. Accompanied by Jacob Cox, he found rusted muskets and inoperable cannon, among other things. This, however, did not deter him from creating an exceptional force of volunteers. McClellan's efforts were noticed in Washington. On May the 23rd, the Union War Department issued General Order No. 14. This order consolidated regiments from Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois into the Department of the Ohio, with McClellan in command. Later, regiments from Missouri would also be added. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee had been appointed to command military forces in the state of Virginia. On May 4th, 1861, he sent Colonel George Porterfield to Grafton to organize troops that were being raised there. Porterfield was less than thrilled upon his arrival in Grafton. Few men had rallied to the Confederate cause. Those who did had little or no training. Ammunition was lacking, and of the few companies raised in nearby towns, some did not even have weapons. But why Grafton? If you look at the map, you will see that Grafton, right here, was a key strategic point in western Virginia. It was at the junction of the Parkersburg-Grafton Railroad, also referred to as the Northwestern Virginia Railroad, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. But Grafton was a Union town. Porterfield was not thrilled with his command. In his report to headquarters, he said, "This force is not only deficient in drill, but ignorant, both officers and men, of the most ordinary duties of the soldier. Deficient drill officers, they might be made effective, but I have to complain the field officers sent to command these men are of no assistance to me and are for the most part as ignorant of their duties as the company officers, and they as ignorant as the men. You see, Porterfield knew that federal troops were approaching Grafton from the north. He realized he could not hold Grafton, which was a pro-Union town, with the 800 troops that he had. So Porterfield withdrew 25 miles south to Philippi, a secessionist town. Porterfield burned a few bridges as he retreated to slow any pursuit from the Federals. Meanwhile, delegates from 27 Western Virginia counties assembled at Washington Hall in Wheeling to consider a responsive action to the Ordinance of Secession. One faction of delegates wanted immediate statehood. Cooler heads, however, prevailed, and a decision was made to wait on the results of the May 23rd referendum. It was a foregone conclusion, however, that the vote would be in favor of secession. On Sunday, May 26th, McClellan received word that bridges on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in Western Virginia had been burned the previous night. That was all the impetus that McClellan needed. The B&O was a vital link between Washington and the Midwest. It provided an easy path through the Appalachian Mountains, but it passed through Confederate territory in a few places. So, to protect against threats to the B&O and to protect the loyal citizens in Western Virginia, McClellan launched his invasion into Virginia. McClellan sent word to Colonel Benjamin Franklin Kelly in Wheeling. Kelly's orders were to proceed to Fairmont. So Kelly requested transportation from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The request was refused. The B&O would remain neutral and would not carry troops or ammunition for either side. Kelly was livid. He immediately responded to the B&O agent. This is war. Railroad companies cannot be their own masters. They are to serve the government that guarantees to them possession and protection for their property. You have a train of cars in the depot tomorrow morning at 4 o'clock, or I will place you in prison and take possession of your railroad by military authority. And there was a prison just up the street. Well, guess what? There was a train of cars waiting at 4 in the morning. So early in the morning of the 27th, the 1st Virginia, commanded by Colonel Kelly, left Camp Carlisle on Wheeling Island and marched across the suspension bridge on the way to the B&O depot. The 14th and 18th Ohio, based in Marietta, also crossed the Ohio River, marched to Parkersburg, and boarded a train heading east towards Grafton. Kelly's force moved east on one branch of the B&O. He was under orders to take no risks. If he was confronted by a force superior in either manpower or firepower, Kelly was to simply observe and send for support. His main objective was to protect the railroad and the bridges on the way to Fairmont. On this map, you can see the routes taken by both forces as they approached Fairmont. In Indianapolis, Brigadier General Thomas A. Morris received orders to prepare for a move with the 6th and 7th Indiana to Parkersburg and on to Grafton. Morris arrived in Grafton on the evening of June the 1st. There he met with Colonel Kelly, who had organized an expedition for that night against the Confederates in Philippi. After conferring with Colonel Kelly, it was determined that the attack would occur the following night. So at 9 a.m. on the morning of June 2nd, 4 regiments organized into 2 divisions left Grafton and headed for Philippi. One division, we will call the left column, consisted of 1,600 troops and was under the command of Colonel Kelly, pictured here on the left. The left proceeded east on the B&O for 6 miles. This was intended to give the illusion of an advance on Harper's Ferry. Colonel Ebenezer Dumont, pictured here on the right, commanded the right column. He proceeded by rail with a force of 1,400 to a small town called Webster. There, the men disembarked from the train and marched to Philippi so they would arrive in the front of the town at about 4 a.m. The objective of Dumont's column was to divert attention until the attack made by Colonel Kelly, and then to aid him if resistance was offered. Once the two columns joined, the whole force was to be under the command of Colonel Kelly. Both columns advanced toward Philippi through torrential rain. But Porterfield knew they were coming. Two women from Fairmont had detoured around Grafton earlier that day and brought information of Colonel Kelly's plans. That evening, after conferring with his officers, Porterfield decided that the only hope of avoiding capture was a retreat south to Beverly. That retreat would begin at daybreak. However, due most likely to the storm and also to the lack of training, the Confederates did not set pickets that night to warn of any approach by the enemy. Colonel Dumont's column arrived on a ridge overlooking Philippi known as Talbot Hill. Here, an artillery battery was placed to support the column as it crossed the covered bridge into town. Dumont was to wait for a signal, a single shot from Colonel Kelly, indicating his troops were in place before commencing the bombardment. At this point, a Mr. Murphy reared his ugly head. If anything could go wrong, it did. Kelly's column had taken a wrong fork in the road and would end up on the same side of town as Colonel Dumont's men. Originally, the two forces were to approach from opposite ends of the town in order to trap the Confederates in the middle. As Kelly's column approached Philippi, it passed by the home of Matilda Humphreys. Mrs. Humphreys sent her son to Philippi to warn of the approaching Federals. The boy was immediately captured. Upon seeing this, Mrs. Humphreys fired a single shot from a pistol at the men capturing her son. Hearing the shot, Dumont ordered the battery to commence firing in support of his advancing troops. Upon the bombardment's commencement, Colonel Porterfield ordered two companies to prevent the Federals from crossing the bridge. They resisted, but it was too little, too late. Colonel Lander, seeing this resistance, made a mad dash on horseback down the hill through heavy underbrush to rally his men in their attempt to enter the town. Lander's men crossed the covered bridge here. Meanwhile, Colonel Kelly's men are coming from this direction. The two forces meet right here where the star is. The Confederates, seeing the two forces, begin to fall back. Kelly and Lander had entered the town simultaneously. As he led his men through the town, Kelly was shot through the chest and fell from his horse. His wound was thought to be mortal. In fact, the June 7th edition of the Richmond Enquirer reported Kelly's death. Kelly, however, he was a tough old bird, and he would recover and go on to command the Department of West Virginia. As the Federals were proceeding through the town, the Confederates turned and got out of there as fast as they could. They ran. For that reason, this engagement is often referred to as the Philippi Races. The Confederates withdrew southward and reached Beverly that evening. The next evening they withdrew even further to Huttonsville. There they would remain until General Robert Selden Garnett arrived with reinforcements to relieve Colonel Porterfield. On July the 4th, a court of inquiry was convened at Porterfield's request. He was praised for his coolness and courage during the retreat, but he was censured for not taking precautionary measures beforehand. He would never hold command again. One little side story here before we finish is the story of James Hanger. Hanger was a Confederate private, and he arrived in Philippi with his company on June the 2nd. That night, his company had taken shelter in a barn to get out of the storm. As the bombardment had begun, a cannonball came through the barn and hit hanger right below the knee. He would eventually become the first amputee of the Civil War, as he was operated on by Union surgeons. He was later involved in a prisoner exchange and found himself back home, where he spent the next couple of months putting together a prosthetic limb that had joints at the knee and the ankle. James Hanger would go on to become the founder of Hanger Prosthetics and Orthopedics, one of the leading prosthetic companies in the world today. Well, that's all, folks. We thank you for watching and hope you join us next time as we explore the Battle of Rich Mountain.